Welcome to Investing in Comic Books. I'm Terry Hoknes. Today on our show, we're going to look back at another classic comic book and we're going to decide how good of an investment it is. We're going to look at the pros and cons of this particular book. Today we choose Amazing Spider-Man issue 121 from Marvel, 1973. This book is now 40 years old. Few comics in the entire history of comics have achieved the kind of milestone status as this one has. This issue featured the death of Gwen Stacy, which rocked the Marvel Universe at that time. Deaths in comics of major characters was almost unheard of at that time. And this was also a time when the reader and the collector really didn't know it was coming up. And they had to buy it at their newsstands when they came out, and it took everybody by surprise. And of course it was a follow-up to Amazing Spider-Man 122, which had another tragic death coming up. But looking at number 121 today, let's just quickly look at an overview of the CGC census. You'll notice that I've got two samples for dates here, one from March 2010 and one from September 2012. So over that 2.5-year period, you can see that another 300 copies have been graded by CGC in all conditions. And there are now 133 copies graded 9.6 or better. And Heritage Auctions over the last decade have sold 143 copies. So kind of looking at that information, that tells us Heritage sells roughly about 13 copies a year, or roughly one a month in some condition. 9.6 or better, 133 copies, that is quite a few. We're going to break that down in just a moment. 1,778 copies in total. Keep in mind this is an early 70s comic. By this time the price guide was already well established with Overstreet, and many people were now collecting comics as the original issues, Silver Age key Marvel books, were already climbing in value quickly every year. So there was lots of interest in Spider-Man, who of course was Marvel's biggest selling title at that time. And when this comic came out, I don't have the exact numbers, but I would guess this comic was selling probably around 300,000 copies a month. So that's how many there could be a print run of this particular book. So when you break that down, 133 high-grade copies out of 300,000, that's actually not too many have survived. Let's jump down and look at the Overstreet annual price guides for the last 7 years. First thing I notice is the highest grade has been constantly going up, and it's almost funny because it's been an exact $25 increase every single year, but at least it's got a nice steady growth. And the 9.0 also has had a smaller but steady growth. But what I notice is for the 8 and any grade less, it's just about been stalled for the last 7 years straight. So already I'm going to say, if you're planning to invest in this book with an 8 or less, if it's ungraded, it ain't going up anytime soon. So I would not recommend it already based on these numbers. There's just no movement. The simple fact is, I mentioned there's 300,000 copies potentially out there that were printed. Sure, a lot have not survived, but those that did, of course, are going to be all 8 and less. So truly, the rare copies are the 9s and higher. And that's the only place we're seeing growth. In fact, because there's been resistance for all the lower grades to move at all, I wouldn't be surprised if there was even a price correction in the future and prices even fell a little bit. What this also means is likely that you can possibly buy this book for under guide on eBay in the lower grades because it just isn't moving. Let's look at some of Heritage Auctions' best sales for this book over the last decade. The biggest sale they ever had, they've actually had two for the same price in 2002 and 2003. They sold 2 copies graded 9.8, which sold for over $6,500. Now at that time, that was about 22 times guide value for a 9.2. But they've had a more recent sale on the list. You'll see one from 2012, same condition, and it sold for $2,600. So that, based on the current guide, sold for about 5 times guide. So that is a big change. So what did we learn from that? Well, when the first copies came out graded 9.8, everyone jumped at them thinking that this might be the only copy they'll ever get, because 9.8 is a true beauty for a book 40 years old, especially a key book like this. So the initial first copies would have sold really well. This happens for all major key books, and especially those of Bronze Age or more recent. So this is no exception. It sold really high, the first copies, but of course, as the market brought out more and more, we realized the book isn't as rare as we thought. And we saw on the census that there's now 31 books graded 9.8. But 9.6, there's over 100 copies. So already there, a 9.6 is almost nothing special. Still a beautiful book, still high demand. And still, you're going to get almost 4 times guide for a 9.6. Still, you know, for a 9.6 and 9.8, everyone, of course, wants them. These are the premium copies, the best in the world. So people do want them. Looking at the census, as typical for Bronze Age books, we've got a lot of mid to high range books have been graded. People hoping they've got a really good copy, but the majority of them kind of coming around the very fine grade. And of course, there's very few low grade copies, simply because people know there's no point in grading those books. They're, of course, very common. So the census makes it look like the low grades are rare, but of course, it's the opposite. They're so common that people don't even bother to grade them. And secondly, 2.0 good copy, only worth $20. So it's just not even worth paying CGC to get the copies slapped. So that affects that chart. So what did we learn today? There is a lot of copies out here. This is Marvel's biggest selling title, always the most popular to collect. That means demand is always high. It's always going to sell. This is one of the most important Spider-Man books of the last 40 years. Definitely a key issue, but there's lots of copies out there. More and more high-grade copies coming on the market. More and more copies being sold. Luckily, demand is high enough. These books do sell, and it always will sell. I can guarantee that. The Overstreet Price Guide shows that the highest grades are constantly moving up, and of course anything above 9.2 is always going to bring multiples of guide, so that's good if you have one of those. But anything with an 8 or less, do I give it thumbs up or down? I'm going to give, for investment's sake, an 8.0 or less a thumbs down, and 9.0 or up, I'm going to give it a thumbs up. We'd like to thank you for checking out this video. We publish a series of books called Investing in Comics, where we look at the entire history of the comic industry, all the publishers, all the major titles, all the time periods, silver, gold, bronze, atomic. And you can check out all our book series at hawknescomics.com. I've been putting these books together for 20 years, compiling all the best known data to give you the best sources of information to make a wise choice if you're going to use your hard-earned money to invest in classic comic books. And so we hope you'll check out our site, and we'd like to thank you again. If there's a book that you would like me to do a video for that you're personally interested in, please send me an email at hawknes@hotmail.com. I'll see what I can do for you. Check out all our other videos. We keep adding them constantly. And once again, thanks for checking out this video, and we hope to see you again soon.